How's everything been with you? Staying safe where you are?
Oh yeah. We Maryland, we're right outside DC, in between DC and Baltimore. So we're pretty safe. It's pretty quiet, rainy today. That's the big one.
All right, well, that's good to hear. So, again, thanks for taking the time to meet with us and discuss the cannabis industry. So, before we get into it, I'd love to hear like your background, how you started, how you got to where you are today, and just your general overview.
I actually started out in oil and gas back almost 20 years ago at this point. And it was a very interesting time because that was a period where the markets were very volatile. Dot-com bust, all that kind of stuff. And then that just set the groundwork for everything that I ended up loving. Those were where I worked for these guys that were some of the smartest people I've ever known in my entire life. And they took the time to teach me some really important lessons that stay with me to today. And I always like to repeat. One of the big ones being uh, the markets generally, the markets ultimately only move in one direction, and that's up. That you can go back through history and see like every crash like we saw this year, but throughout history, there'll be down days, weeks, months, maybe even like down years, but ultimately they move in only one direction, and that's up. And so if you take advantage of those opportunities, take advantage of these sell-offs and any sort of big pullbacks, that's how you're ultimately going to come out ahead. And so all the strategies that I've developed over the years all relate back to that simple point, this simple point that, take advantage of stocks or sectors that have pulled back steeply, look for the best opportunities, and then ride it back higher. So that's how I got my start in investing. That's how I started with seasonal trading, which was a big one because that's a very cyclical pattern. You see that repeated over and over again, that companies will sell off during their least busy times of the year where they're reporting revenue growth that isn't great, or a sequential decline. I always talk about like retail and transports. Those are two really key industries where you can see that. Like if you look at Macy's fourth quarter revenue and what it makes in the first quarter, there's a huge step down. And so a lot of times investors see that and they sell off those shares. There's no reason to hold it. So those are the strategies that I started building. And then cannabis goes back all the way to when I was a teenager. I had a family member that they had a friend that was dying of cancer, and they had approached me about finding finding them some cannabis to help ease with that. And to me that was like a really kind of big moment, because here is something like this person had gone through chemo, they weren't eating, they were kind of wasting away, feeling nauseous, all those sort of symptoms. And so, but this medicine wasn't kind of legally available to them. So this family member was coming to me to try and find it on the illicit market. So that's like that first kind of big eye-opening thing on cannabis, and this. I mean, it was still at that time illegal medicinally, and even recreationally across the country. My wife has her own chronic pain ailment, as she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Cannabis has been something in that community for several years, and so a lot of the doctors that I meet and talk to and interview, that's actually where I first met them. I first met them through those sort of communities where they were talking about treating using cannabis to treat chronic pain, to treat anxiety, sleep disorders, all that kind of stuff. So that's where that personal side of the industry came in. And then from a financial standpoint, once Washington, Colorado started legalized adult use, that's where you're like, okay, well, maybe there's an opportunity here. Then when Canopy goes public in 2014, the first federally regulated and licensed producer in North America to be traded on a public exchange, you start waking up to like, okay, so maybe there's an opportunity here besides like some of these penny stocks that have been sort of trading for a couple of years and that are still penny stocks. And then I started preparing investors for this. I started writing about it in 2016. Then 2017 started preparing investors for that nationwide legalization that took place in Canada in 2018, and then as well as the cannabis 2.0 stuff since then. So that's my background and how I got started in the industry. And like I said, getting started in finance, like most people, you just kind of you wander into it. Like I would, I went to art school. I wanted to be an artist, photographer and illustrator. I never, those were my dreams growing up. I never thought that I would end up in finance or investing, but those ideas that I learned in art carry over to finance.
Yeah, I think I mean, I love everything you said. You have a great, extremely interesting background. I think a lot of the things touch base with, like, even myself. I mean, me personally, I went to school originally starting out as a pre-med major and then ended up moving over to business economics. But I think a lot of the things you said with how you got into it and how it has like the personal touch really connects with a lot of other people and their interest into the space as well. Now, do you also believe at all that part of it was your background, not only the personal part, but the fact that you have a background in oil and gas? So I feel
Mhm.
like that's an industry that I like to compare, whether it's right, wrong, but I think it has a lot of similarities to the cannabis industry where you could have these great companies that are run fundamentally well, but you just have all these external, may be geopolitical, or some country wakes up on the wrong side of the bed and just keeps producing, that really impact this industry. And especially the fact that it's not yet widely federally legal, where you have potentially tons of these great companies out there that, due to the fact of things outside of their control, that really potentially sway their revenues, their profits, and just how they're able to expand and grow their business.
Exactly. I would make that comparison. Commodities. That's how I kind of started looking at that cannabis. That we started focusing on it as of a commodity in and of itself, because you have all-in costs, you have cost to produce per gram, you have all these other sort of ancillary costs that go into a grow operation. Uh, so yes, I would definitely would see those parallels. I think also at the same time, because of the legal situation, that makes it very kind of unique in and of itself. In Canada, you can kind of grow, and that market is legal nationwide, and those companies can expand, and they have that support from the government. In the United States, it's very weird because it's not legal at the federal level. It's legal at the state level, both medicinally and recreationally. And so for companies to operate, you have to have this infrastructure repeated over and over and over and over again. And it's very, very interesting and very, very frustrating, because there might be a state that is very cheap to produce. Let's say like an Oregon or Washington, where you can grow outside, and you can have like these big massive crops that cost you way less than $1 to produce per gram, but you can't sell it anywhere else except in Oregon or Washington. You can't move finished products across state lines. So you can't have like a manufacturing sector in one state that puts it all together and then ships it out to all your other stuff. Most companies right now are buying components from suppliers in China, having that shipped over here, and then putting it all together. So it's a very interesting industry that does relate to a lot of the commodity sectors that I've covered, but all these other elements to it make it very, very unique and very sort of challenging at times, but also exciting. And so some of that, I've actually talked to CEOs, and they felt there has been somewhat of a protection from the big Canadian movers, big Canadian companies moving in and start gobbling up, smaller companies or our entire dispensary chains, because that is still illegal at the U.S. level. So they're kind of thankful for that, but we'd like to see some sort of change, because then you could really see these companies expand and really start to make efficient enterprises, right? Because right now they all run like in these strange, inefficient ways because, like I said, this duplicative infrastructure in every single state that you operate. And so that's kind of what you saw. I thought like in 2018 and 2019, as we had that big M&A push, that here are all these costs that you're now going to have to grapple with, that you're going to have to open up dispensaries, you have to open up these brick and mortars, and then open up all your individual grow ops. And if you're not running your own, like the dispensaries that I hear from, your supplier, your third party supplier, well, it's hit or miss. This is something that as grown, it is very difficult if it's grown outside or even inside to replicate over and over and over. At this point, the quality can really vary really largely from month to month.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, in general, any company, how effective your supply chain can make or break you. But I'm assuming with the volatility in the cannabis industry, that is even more at the forefront, that you need to have everything running as efficiently as possible so that when you get these seasonal ebbs and flows where pricing or goes up and down, that you're able to weather that storm. And even though you may be taking that slight loss here, you're making it up on the when that peaks a little bit differently. How sticking like the macro level
Mm-hmm.
question we're currently having, what do you think that eventually do you think the introduction of a cannabis futures contract will eventually allow these companies to smooth out these volatilities in their pricing and just the cost of their product a little bit?
I guess that it could if there was some sort of product created like that, but with those costs, I mean, we even talked about a couple of years ago a possible mass extinction event just in terms of packaging, because these regulations change and ebb and flow, and you're buying, companies are buying wholesale to get that best price per unit. Well, a state changes or tweaks, some sort of packaging regulation. Well, all of that now has to be thrown away or written down. So a cannabis future contract would definitely help out the industry. Not sure of the mechanics of that at the moment, because of the legality situation in the U.S. But if it was something in Canada, definitely.
Yeah, I think that eventually it will eventually go that way. So it's going to be interesting to see how these other financial products are introduced to the market. Now, considering the times we're in with especially like COVID and everything, and usually in any down market, you see those upticks in M&A activity because there are those deals out there that traditionally maybe in a higher market are just a little bit outside those price points for these companies. So, for example, Akerna with Trellis, Aurora just recently with Revilla, all
Mhm.
your acquisition via stock. Do you think that what we're going to eventually see is kind of how alcohol and Anheuser-Busch, you have all these microbrewers that are becoming extremely popular, and instead of Anheuser trying to compete with that, they're just now requiring these. So do you think that's the direction in which the cannabis industry is going, where you're just going to see a couple big players that are now, instead of these small dispensary operations, just start to acquire them and just collect all these different portfolios of these small companies?
I think you're actually already have seen that begun. One of the things that a couple of years ago, the former CEO of Canopy, Bruce Linton, had said that, you're only going to really see 5 or 6, maybe half a dozen cannabis companies be in existence after I think it was like a decade or something like that, and everybody sort of laughed at it. But then we had like this big M&A boom just over the last couple of years. This year is much lighter than it has been in years past. I mean, in the U.S., 2018, that was driving like those big run-ups in share price, because every single week it was a record takeover, record takeover, record takeover, record takeover, and the company just got over, the whole industry, not just a company, but got over leveraged. And so you eventually had, during like that the bottoms of that 2019 bear market, where I thought, all right, well, now all these deals have to be renegotiated or simply canceled, because you had like MedMen, who was paying $684 million for PharmaCann well, MedMen's share price was 114, $140 million at that time. It can't it can't fund that big of an acquisition anymore. So you did see a lot of those deals start to be renegotiated. Harvest Health and Recreation has canceled a bunch of deals. Planet 13, they've gone back and forth with this Santa Ana acquisition. Price was too high. They had to renegotiate, cancel it, and go back in. So I do think you'll see a lot of those deals continue to be reworked. But again, once the industry stabilizes, definitely. Canopy has gone out. They have made deals with Martha Stewart, with Snoop Dogg, with Seth Rogen. You've seen Aurora buy a number of companies, just like you mentioned, in the United States. This has been another thing of all these companies trying to create the best portfolio that they can, as well as expand their footprint as much as they possibly can nationally. So once all of that clears, once the current sort of deals kind of work their way through the system, then I think the M&A picks back up again. It's just all part of that cycle. Now, the big thing is if there's a change at the federal level here in the United States, what do those Canadian companies start doing? Do they start coming in and buying up, like Canopy made for Acreage Holdings? So those Canadian companies are entering the market through the CBD space because that's what's legal. They're not violating any sort of TSX regulations where they would get delisted. So, but once there's a change here at the federal level in the United States, I think that's where you see those Canadian companies really, because they're the most capitalized, right, really come in and start gobbling up a lot of these players here in the U.S. And so.
Now, do you see because I followed a couple of these recent acquisitions the last couple of months, and it seems like the big theme is that all of these are being done at the moment for just all pure equity plays. They're maybe not debt or cash or a combination of them. They're usually buying these out for just pure stock and equity into the company. Do you think that is an indicator of anything from maybe a capitalization standpoint of these companies, or that they're willing to maybe acquire these companies at the cost of their own equity versus actually any debt structure or outlaying any cash capital for these companies at all?
I think that straight up goes back to the capital crunch that has been plaguing the industry, that they don't have a lot of cash flying around, so they are having to do these acquisitions through equity. That's a dilution process. That's not the best thing for shareholders at the time. There's also companies out there that we know that are paying their bills or have been rumored to pay their bills with issuing stock to suppliers. So I think that right there just shows that there's a cash problem in the industry, that they have no choice but to go out there and issue shares for these takeovers. Because anytime right now, we still have the same thing. Anytime a company announces that they have like a new injection of cash from another big investor, you get a pop. But I think the real sort of kind of issue is that share dilution for shareholders that is somewhat problematic long term.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be like, once the liquidity in these markets clear up for them to be capitalized, that I think it will allow these companies to run more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
I really agree with that. With like COVID going on and how we've seen, at least in the short term, in the last 2 months, how this has impacted the industry, where even though it is federally illegal, they've still been deemed essential businesses in certain states. So how do you think this, assuming that it still continues to play out in relatively the same state with COVID over the next couple of months, impacts the cannabis sector?
How do I think COVID impacts the cannabis sector? I think what you've seen is that the industry has been remarkably resilient. I mean, 2019 seems like decades ago at this point, but we did have the EVALI last year, which was really plaguing on the industry. When COVID first came here to the United States, I thought this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back for that industry, that you're going to see a number of collapses because your consumers were going to dry up. You had another sort of health lung issue to deal with on top of the Ebola that plagued it last year, and that's adds to all of the capital crunch and the debt problems that we've had. Since then, you've seen that the industry has been able to pivot, to do curbside pickup, to do delivery. I think those pieces, those elements, those are now permanent. I think those are here to stay because it is an essential business, and they are delivering medicines. And a lot of those patients, they do have compromised immune systems. So you're going to keep that probably forever. Let's go ahead and we'll just say that's in there. I don't think the COVID surprisingly has had that big of an impact on the industry as a whole. We know that Nevada, like those sales in March fell by a quarter. I mean, that's not a surprise. There was no March Madness. There was no St. Patty's Day sort of celebration. None of those conferences that were taking place. So that's not an issue. But you did see, sales tick up in California. You did see sales tick up in Washington, in Maryland, and then in Colorado. So the industry is showing that it's not really being impacted that much, especially the big players. And you even heard from TrueLeaf recently that said, COVID-19 hasn't hurt their business. And that is a pure medicinal cannabis play just on the Florida market, that 47 or 49 of their dispensaries are in that state. And that is just a medicinal state. So long term, I think this will strengthen the position of those companies that are doing quite well. Green Thumb Industries, first MSO to report $100 million in quarterly revenue. We expected Curaleaf and TrueLeaf to do the same. They came close but didn't. But I think those probably report 100 million the next quarter. And so this is strong. There's other companies in the sector though that I think this will be their shakeout, right? Like and it's not because they had bad business plans. I mean, just wrong time. There are companies that whose plans were very innovative, but had a lot of person-to-person contact, that you were going to stay in an area, lounge around a store. You have like a CBD company like Green Growth that was buying up shops in malls, which already had declining traffic. It was a fair enough business model then. On the backside of COVID-19, how viable is that? How many people are going to go to malls? You've now got.
It's been a dying thing for years at this point. So I don't know if any company, regardless cannabis or any other sector, is smart to be putting their space in a mall these days.
Yeah, and but they opened like 200 stores last year. So I mean, so there are those companies which, maybe their plans would have worked in a pre-COVID-19 world, but post, I'm a little more skeptical.
Were you because at least I was, were you surprised when you saw like these numbers come in where COVID actually, like some of the numbers I were able to pull was that you saw like 65% increase in sales, 30% uptick in edible sales during this time. Was that a surprise to you, or that was something where it wasn't really surprised, but what was your take on that?
Some of it was, I thought was, we saw some hoarding numbers. We knew early on that there was a big hoarding taking place before all the lockdowns. But, the medicinal markets, the edible markets, those are both very, very, very strong markets here in the United States. So I think those are good. You also had, for Canada, that first real quarter of Cannabis 2.0 sales, and that was a huge thing. So that market is, potentially twice the size of like an inhalation market, because people are more likely to drink or consume cannabis than they are to smoke it. And that's just the nature of what we know now, that smoking is bad for you. And then again, over the past couple of years, all these lung diseases adding to that. So that wasn't too much of a surprise for me. I thought this year, coming into 2020, I was actually really bullish on cannabis because I thought this was the year that our comparables are going to be very positive to 2019. You're going to see that growth. People are going to start turning profits. We're going to start making money. They weren't spending so much to build up this inventory. But I said I got a little bearish there in February and March, where you had the COVID impact coming in, and that created more uncertainty for an industry that had a lot of uncertainty. And I'm very happy that it's been able to survive and grow and show that it's resilient, and maybe even gets thrown in there with that vice stock category, which I've been talking about for the last couple of years, that during a recession, that cannabis might be like a really solid play because it could go in there with alcohol and casinos and adult entertainment and firearms, all those industries that do very, very well during a recession. And that's what we're seeing now. Still very, very early, but you are seeing those early signs that it is doing extraordinarily well.
Yeah, I mean, now, do you think that with what we're going through and a lot of these states that now, I mean, most states' budgets are more or less in a very sensitive place in general, and seeing what this is forecasted to do to states' budgets, do you think this is potentially going to accelerate the federal legalization just because these states need that revenue coming in, that this is just a very simple, easy, like if you're going to pick something, I would say, why not pull that lever of let's legalize cannabis, because then that's tax revenue coming in for us.
Yeah, I actually think that this is a great moment for the legalization effort because, like you're saying, those tax revenues. I was actually surprised that, let's say, like, no one's going on the road. The states didn't go out and put more speed cameras everywhere. I thought that was something that they could do to add more tax revenue. But legalization of cannabis, especially on the medicinal side, we know that the majority of people support this much higher than just adult use. So I think you'll probably see the rest of those states fill out with the medicinal legalization. Adult use, it always tends to be a little bit controversial. New York continues to try to push forward with it, but that keeps getting kind of shut down. But I do think in the long term, if not this year, that in the years that we see ahead, that it has to. I still contend that by 2025, we'll probably see some change at the federal level. That's been my long-term belief, because you have so much support for it. By that point, so many states will probably have legalized it that you're just kind of like, all right, well, we'll just go ahead and legalize it for the tax revenue purposes, but also to allow those companies to operate more efficiently.
Now, what's your thoughts on if you think they're going to do it correctly in the way that we're going to tax this product so much where people are still going to that black market for the product because they could get a fraction of the price? Do you think states are going to kind of realize that, or you think kind of like how municipalities work, they're going to get it wrong?
I think we've already seen that that's probably going to be a learning curve. There are states over the last couple of years where those markets have collapsed because you just had so many grow licenses. You had such a surplus, and it's locked to that state, that you then had the growers started getting busted because they were selling it illicitly. And I also believe that illicit market with EVALI shows its kind of danger. That's my number one concerns that just keeps in the back of everyone's mind. EVALI came from the illicit market, but impacted all these public companies. So I do think that they will probably get it wrong in the beginning, but you just have to hope again that over time it kind of wears that market out. But I don't think we've seen the illicit market here in the United States is still 55 billion, something like that. So it's still quite large compared to the actual legal market.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, just because you hear all these stories, people showing their itemized receipts from these shops, and it's like, okay, 60% of it is the tax component of it. So you're really not incentivizing anyone to go legitimately. so that not only are they getting a legal regulated product that they know exactly what they're getting, and the states are getting that millions of dollars in revenue, it's still encouraging the everyday person to, which more or less, unless you're somebody that was brought up into it where you're younger, where it's, oh, it's always been legal, going through with the right channel. To most consumers come from the background of getting it from their guy down the street or whatever it is. So for
Yeah.
that, not incentivized to get it the legitimate way.
Yeah, I think that again, that's why that has to be that medicinal market first, where you're going to have prescriptions. Now, again, all the doctors I've talked to over the years, there's always a sort of war between prescribers and maybe dispensaries because they're operating on two different sort of revenue paths. Like if the doctor will prescribe something that's very low THC content, just like maybe an eighth or something like that, that's all you need. But then the patient will get to the dispensary and then upsold to 3 times the THC content and the max number of grams, be like, this is, the best bang for your buck. And then the patients end up not using the product because they just become overwhelmed, especially, like grandmothers and grandfathers. So I think that the medicinal market will be the first inroads, and that has to be the thing that changes the adult use market, because probably a lot of those users are have their own sort of maybe black market dealer. Those are going to be hard to convince over. That's why I also think that those infused products, that's another great inroad, like gummies, chocolates, some sort of infused beverage. That will be a good introduction, and that's where I kind of bank a lot of my expectations on for the future.
So that leads right to my next question for me. So I was going to say, what would you say over the next 5-10 years is going to be that area within the cannabis industry that you're going to see the biggest growth over the short and long term?
I definitely believe that'll be those infused products. Gummies are already great sellers. It's not too surprising since they have enough sugar content that it hides the taste of the THC, the oil. Chocolates do an okay job. The problem is, like, gummies can't be prescribed by a doctor. They would love to, but let's say if you're prescribing something to somebody that's got diabetes, you're not going to be like, all right, well, go buy this sugary product to consume to help treat with the pain from diabetes. No, that's not going to happen. But I think for the regular consumer, the everyday consumer, that's a good inroad. And those are things that people probably feel much more comfortable about because, one, an edible, or let's say like a gummy, you can slice into to little pieces, or you can take the whole thing, or you can ease your way into it. Same thing with a drink. And I think there'll be that learning curve as well, like we had with alcohol. Canopy has always wanted, like, especially when it was Bruce Linton, wanted people to be able to go into a bar and order, a tweed and tonic. That would be their play on, the gin and tonic or vodka tonic. So those areas I think are excellent. And I've talked to Organigram's CEO, and they talked about the fact that they believe that they can make an infused beverage that comes in at a much lower price point than beer, especially in Canada where beer is very expensive. So that way you win that pocketbook war, that when a consumer goes, okay, well, I can buy a beer for this, or I can buy an infused beverage for this, and I'm going to get like the same effect. Well, I'll probably go that way. So I am very excited about Cannabis 2.0 as well as infused products here in the United States. That's my favorite category.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a very interesting time over the next 5 to 10 years in this industry, especially with like these cities and states needing that additional revenue. So I know we were talking about like opportunities in the market at the beginning, and I personally have been in and out of the market through this. So a couple of the companies like Aurora, I was a little kicking myself for not buying that 2-3 weeks ago, and I was like, oh, it looks like it's pretty good, but it's still like 90% below its high. I was like, is it really worth it, or is it going further down? And then you look over the last 2 weeks, it's skyrocketed. So if you had to pick 3 companies that you said that you think are good ideas to watch over the next year, 3 years, which ones would you go with?
right off the bat, I say this one, they don't pay me, but Canopy Growth Corp. That to me is such a great company. It's anytime it's between like this $15 to $20 range, that to me is a buy, especially anytime that dips below that, like we saw earlier this year. The company just has this large footprint. They have all these celebrity products. They have all their premium brands. They have the backing from Constellation for those infused beverages. So that's an easy one to me. I also like, you know, ancillary companies. What we let's say like something like a Grow Generation, which is a very, very small, about $6 stock, but that is a hydroponics and organic gardening company. It's done well this year, but I think what you see is as cannabis expands across the United States, especially those medicinal markets, Grow Generation expands with it, and it has these stores, and it just does really, really well. It has this constant sort of inflow. And so not only is it just cannabis, but also just regular, just sort of gardening supply. So I like that company. Innovative industrial properties, that to me is also like a good one. It's a little bit more expensive as a real estate investment trust, but one, you're also getting paid that dividend because it has to give the majority of what it earns back in the form of a dividend. And you've had a lot of growth there. So that is a company that, again, as the industry expands, it moves in, buys up industrial space, leases it back to a grower. More than 99%, I believe, of its square footage is leased at this point. And so those are good ones, I think, just for if I only had to have three, those would be my three. Now, does not mean that I think there aren't even more opportunities in the industry, but those were where I would start, especially for a new investor. Like I said, I know that IIPR is a little bit more expensive than most people might like, but I like that dividend.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that and appreciate your time with us today. So thank you for spending the time and giving us your thoughts on it. Do you have any social media, Twitter, anything that you could let us know of that we could, so that our followers can follow you and any of your post articles?
Yeah, I always at profittrends.com. That's where I'll post a lot of my articles, which more than just cannabis. We do Beyond the Bong, which looks at some of the best stocks and opportunities each week, and also 5 companies that we believe are going to have some sort of move. Usually it's going to be around earnings or some sort of hearing. We also have a YouTube channel, Profit Trends, which you can watch there, which we put out a video every Friday afternoon. And then Strategic Trends Investor on Instagram. So those are the 3 social media places.
Great. Thank you, Matt, for spending the time with us today and discussing the industry.
Hey, thanks for having me.